Most people assume the Vikings conquered the North Atlantic through brute courage and blind instinct. Popular imagination reduces their navigation to guesswork, sailing west until they hit land, trusting folklore and luck. But that explanation collapses under scrutiny. The North Atlantic is not forgiving. Fog banks linger for days. Summer storms build without warning. In high latitudes, the sun can vanish behind overcast skies for weeks at a time. Dead reckoning alone is not enough to cross from Norway to Iceland, from Iceland to Greenland, and from Greenland to Vinland without catastrophic loss. The lesser-known reality is this: Norse expansion into the North Atlantic required a navigational method that worked when the sky offered no clear sun, no visible stars, and no coastal reference points. Without it, Greenland would have been a short-lived accident of exploration rather than a colony that endured for centuries. The device at the center of this discussion, the so-called sunstone, was not mystical. It was practical. It represents a quiet example of environmental adaptation, and it tells us far more about Viking survival strategy than any raid ever could. The North Atlantic was less a highway and more a calculated risk. When we talk about Viking voyages, we often focus on destinations: Lindisfarne, Dublin, York. Yet the truly transformative voyages were westward, into an ocean that offered no political reward and no guaranteed supply lines. Sailing from Norway to Iceland meant committing to several days out of sight of land. From Iceland to Greenland required even greater exposure. The Norse did not possess magnetic compasses in the early phases of this expansion. The magnetic compass would not become common in Europe until centuries later. Instead, Viking navigation relied on a combination of coastal memory, oral tradition, wind patterns, bird migrations, wave direction, and solar positioning. This system worked reasonably well in clear weather. It became far more precarious under heavy cloud cover or fog. A ship that lost its directional reference could drift hundreds of miles off course. In the North Atlantic, that meant missing Greenland entirely or failing to find Iceland after leaving Norway. Either error risked starvation or death from exposure. The fact that Norse settlers repeatedly reached these distant lands suggests they possessed a method for orienting themselves even when the sky was obscured. The sagas preserve a clue that historians once dismissed too quickly. The medieval Icelandic sagas refer to a sólarsteinn, or sunstone. In one account, a king lifts this stone to locate the sun's position on a cloudy day. For a long time, historians treated these references as symbolic or mythical. The sagas were written down centuries after the events they describe, and scholars often separated literary embellishment from practical detail. Yet, experimental archaeology has changed that conversation. Certain crystals, most notably Iceland's spar, a transparent form of calcite, have the ability to polarize light. Even when the sun is hidden behind clouds, sunlight still scatters through the atmosphere in predictable polarization patterns. A birefringent crystal can reveal subtle shifts in light intensity, allowing a trained observer to infer the sun's location. This is not mystical speculation. Modern experiments have demonstrated that with practice, a navigator can use such a crystal to determine the sun's direction within a few degrees, even under heavy cloud cover or near twilight. That degree of accuracy is more than sufficient for open ocean travel when combined with knowledge of currents and prevailing winds. What matters is not whether every Viking ship carried such a stone, but that the concept aligns with the environmental demands they faced. Understanding polarized light meant understanding the sky as a system. The Vikings were not physicists in the modern sense, but they were careful observers of nature. Survival in the North Atlantic required it. Fishermen, farmers, and sailors alike depended on reading subtle environmental cues. The idea that experienced navigators could learn to interpret polarized light through a crystal is consistent with that broader pattern of environmental literacy. In high latitudes, the sun's path across the sky changes dramatically with the seasons. During summer, it barely dips below the horizon. During winter, it remains low and weak. Navigators needed to account for these variations. A sunstone would not replace knowledge of seasonal solar arcs, it would refine and confirm it under marginal conditions. This distinction matters. The Norse did not rely on a single technological solution. They integrated tools into a broader mental map of the world. That mindset, combining environmental awareness with simple but effective instruments, is one of the most overlooked aspects of their expansion. Greenland's survival depended on navigational reliability. The Norse colony in Greenland, established around the late 10th century, survived for roughly 450 years. Its endurance depended on periodic contact with Iceland and Norway. Ships brought iron, timber, and other resources that Greenland lacked. In return, Greenland exported walrus, ivory, and other goods. Maintaining that trade route required consistent navigation across a hostile ocean corridor. A single missed landfall could doom a voyage. If the Greenland settlements were isolated for too long, they faced material decline. We often discuss Greenland's eventual collapse in terms of climate change and economic shifts. Those factors were real. But the earlier centuries of survival imply logistical competence. Reliable navigation under variable conditions was not optional. It was foundational. If the sunstone contributed even marginal improvements in directional accuracy during overcast weather, it would have had measurable consequences for the colony's viability. Technological modesty can produce strategic advantage. The sunstone, if used as described, was not an elaborate machine. It required no moving parts. It did not depend on metallurgy or advanced mathematics. It was portable, durable, and silent. Its effectiveness relied on training rather than mechanical complexity. This reflects a broader pattern in early seafaring cultures. Small improvements in reliability often outweigh dramatic innovations. A tool that reduces navigational error by a few degrees can mean the difference between reaching Iceland and missing it entirely. Over multiple voyages, that reliability compounds into expansion, trade networks, and political influence. Modern survivalists often focus on high-technology redundancy. The Viking example offers a counterpoint. Deep environmental knowledge paired with a simple physical principle can outperform more complex systems that fail under stress. When clouds obscure the sky and landmarks disappear, subtle information still exists. The key is knowing how to read it. The archaeological record suggests the idea persisted longer than expected. In 1971, a fragment of Iceland's spar was discovered in the wreck of an English ship that sank in 1592. By that time, magnetic compasses were already widespread. Yet someone aboard that vessel carried a polarizing crystal. This suggests that knowledge of polarized light navigation may have persisted quietly alongside the compass. The compass itself can behave unpredictably at high latitudes due to magnetic variation. Near the Arctic Circle, declination shifts can introduce navigational error if not corrected. A sunstone, unaffected by magnetism, would provide an independent reference. Even in the early modern period, redundancy had value. This raises the possibility that Viking-era techniques were not isolated curiosities, but part of a longer continuum of practical seamanship. Technologies do not always disappear cleanly. Some remain in the background, used when conditions demand them. What the sunstone reveals about preparedness culture. The deeper lesson here is not about crystals, it is about mindset. The Norse expansion into the North Atlantic was not reckless wandering, it was calculated risk management in an unforgiving environment. The sunstone represents a willingness to study natural systems closely and to build tools that align with them. Preparedness is often misunderstood as stockpiling supplies. For the Vikings, preparedness meant mastering wind patterns, memorizing coastlines, understanding seasonal change, and possibly carrying a small crystal that allowed them to orient themselves when visual certainty vanished. They did not eliminate risk, they narrowed it. They accepted that storms would come, that fog would erase the horizon, and that survival required more than courage. It required disciplined observation and repeatable technique. Why this overlooked detail deserves attention. History tends to celebrate spectacle, raids, battles, kings, yet the quieter achievements often shape the world more profoundly. Without reliable navigation, there would have been no sustained Norse presence in Greenland and no credible voyages to North America. Those journeys were not accidents, they were the outcome of accumulated knowledge applied under pressure. The Sunstone, whether widely used or limited to skilled navigators, symbolizes that accumulation. It reminds us that technological advantage does not always appear dramatic. Sometimes it is a matter of seeing what others overlook, literally seeing light patterns in a grey sky. Understanding this changes how we view Viking expansion. It shifts the narrative from romantic adventurism to disciplined environmental adaptation. It also offers a broader lesson about resilience. Success in harsh conditions depends less on boldness than on clarity, calibration, and preparation. Remembering these details matters because they correct the record. They restore complexity to a culture often simplified into caricature, and they remind us that survival, whether in the 10th century or today, begins with understanding the systems that surround us. If you value this kind of in-depth historical analysis, focused not on spectacle, but on the mechanics of survival and decision-making, subscribe to the Prepper Historian and share this video with others who want more than surface-level history.